Today, this morning, we have two speakers. First up, Kanishka Jayasuriya. Now, Kanishka is the Director of International Politics in the University of Adelaide. He's Professor of International Politics. He's Director of the Indo-Pacific Governance Research Centre at the University of Adelaide. And he does research on stuff like global governance and law and regulation, and also the movement from social democracy to market liberalism. And today he's got the wonderful title talk, The Savage Wars of the Capitalist Peace, the New Geoeconomics and the Rise of China. Ladies and gentlemen, Kanishka.
Thanks, David. And thanks David and Georgina, as well as Jerry as well, for inviting me to what's turned out to be, I think, a really interesting workshop. Already sort of, the very stimulating ideas and debates that have come out for me. I've got to say the Savage Wars of the Capitalist Peace, I actually came up with the title before I knew what I was going to write. And of course, this is sort of apologies to Kipling, where he talked about the Savage Wars of Peace. And it seemed like a really nice title, even though the substance of my paper might differ somewhat from the title. I still stuck with it because I thought it was quite nice. Okay. I basically want to frame this paper in terms of, in the context of both in the political science literature, it's called the rising past literature, which in a sense, the kind of disciplinary workshops and conferences I was saying to Georgina that I go to usually sort of, to me, is always framed in terms of this, the rise of China. What are we going to do about the rise of China? How do we respond to the rise of China? Which always seems to me to be really simplistic and really emptied out of the kind of discussion of class that we've seen in this workshop. And I just wish that some of that discussion would rub off on the kind of disciplinary networks in which sometimes that I'm involved in, especially in political science and international relations. The notion of the 18th century plays a prominent part in the 18th century white paper report that a lot of you know. And was brought up yesterday. For those from overseas, the 18th century white paper report was essentially commissioned by Julia Gillard. The process of writing the paper, the actual governance of the paper itself is probably deserves a paper in its own right, because it was, unlike earlier reports, it was actually a report that was written by technocrats. But it was written by technocrats and was supposed to organise, what was essentially, I guess, a kind of a potential political critic for the now deposed Prime Minister. But I think I want to use the report here not talk so much about the politics of the report, which, as I said, it's interesting itself, but to in a sense look at some of the broader points that the report, the broader problems in a sense that the report was, the broader problems that I think that the report faces, and the kind of challenges in a sense that it poses for us in social sciences. Because the subtext of the report is that what we're witnessing in Asia today is sort of a profound shift of power and wealth to a rising Asia, and Australia needs to adjust to this. But I think what the report reproduces, in a sense, is all the weaknesses of a national framing of capitalism. And another report written by, essentially by, the former head of the Treasury, Ken Henry, was sort of informed by a lot of neoclassical economic thinking. I actually think that some of those weaknesses are present in more critical understandings of the rise of Asia as well. So the report essentially identifies emerging national champions: India, China, Indonesia, South Korea. And I think and I don't think, I don't need to remind this audience that the problem here is the kind of methodological nationalism that's underpinned the report, because essentially it sees China, it sees Australia, it sees Indonesia, it sees South Korea as essentially these separate national capitalisms that are emerging. And essentially, from the context of regional governance, what it does is that it fails to separate out, it fails to understand, I think, the way in which regional governance mechanisms are actually enmeshed, and this is a point that I'll come to later on, actually enmeshed in the process of state transformation. I mean, it's not, there's an assumption in the report that the regions out there and national capitalisms are out here. And what we need to do is to think about adjusting to that. What it doesn't do is it doesn't understand the way in which those regional transformations, regional processes of capitalist transformation are actually changing relationships between these capitalisms. And in a sense, this is the kind of debate that we saw, that was alluded to in last morning and last afternoon. And I think one of the things the report does is it essentially fails to understand the emergence of China. And I think this is a broader point, and I'm using the report because, in a sense, it's easy to take the report apart. But what I think it fails to understand is how the industrialization, the capitalist transformation of East Asia and Southeast Asia is being undertaken in the context of a post-national industrialization. Where China is essentially linked to these global supply chains. And we saw a wonderful map that we had of the Toyota's automobile industry that you showed in your paper last morning. And Jerry had that a great comment about the point about $1 trillion and how much a minute's worth. And that's great. And this is not going to match that. But my example is that when you had the Bangkok floods, there was a greater impact on Japanese GDP from the Bangkok floods because of the relocation of the Japanese, essentially Japanese automobile industry in and around Bangkok than the Fukushima nuclear accident. So just think about that. Just think about that in terms of the way that's rearranged the whole notion of industrialization and the whole idea of the national framing of industrialization. And we also know that this is the kind of Kanishka Jayasuriya's work that the rise of China was essentially a way of actually managing neoliberalism in the US, the kind of the rise of mortgage Keynesianism in the US, the housing bubble that led to that, and the fact that that kind of supply chain industrialization was crucial to managing declining incomes of working people and of low-income people. And so in a sense, of course, when we talk rather simplistically about China and Chinese and American capitalism competing against each other, we miss the way in which they're actually inextricably intertwined. So I think the economic story then makes impossible this idea that we see, especially in international relations theory, of these two Asians, one a kind of an economic Asia and one a security Asia, and the two essentially being sometimes in conflict. Instead, I want to argue that what we're seeing with this kind of post-national industrialization is the emergence, in a sense, of a new form of geoeconomics that is characterized both by substantial common interest in maintaining and reproducing an effective global capitalist order. If you like, and this is going to be controversial because when I last mentioned it, it's a bit like Kautsky's notion of ultra-imperialism. And I know when I mentioned this last time, there was a real bun fight around that argument. But and obviously I'm using this, you know, I'm using it in a sense as a way of actually, not so much in conceptual terms, but as a way of actually understanding the way in which these different forms of capital are interlinked and the substantial common interest they have in reproducing a global capitalist order. But at the same time, and I think this is where, you know, some of Jerry's work has been really useful, is that these in a sense, these internationalized forms of capital have different interests. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about China is the kind of state, the rise of state capital and the interest of that state capital and the way those interests are then cash out and play out within different regulatory institutions, both at the regional level and at the global level. Look at, for example, the way in which China uses WTO. Look at the way in which, for example, China, and I can't touch on that. I've done that in some of my other writing. The way in which China has used ADB, the Mekong project. Just to give you one quick. How am I doing for time, David?
About 12 minutes left.
Okay. Take for example the Mekong project, which the Chinese government, and very interesting, the Chinese government and the Yunnan province, which of course has substantial interest in the Mekong area, are promoting. And of course, they're promoting infrastructure projects which have a real interest in bearing on state capital in both in Yunnan and more at the national level. So it's the way in which the kind of regulatory projects that are pursued represents these different forms of these different forms of capital. And I want to make a final point because this I think came up in Tom's talk and in Frank's. I think Frank talked about, you know, minivan. I was really pleased when someone mentioned the minivan plan system debate because it takes me back to my sort of undergraduate years when I think I wrote some fantastic essays on the on the minivan finances debate on state theory that some of my students I think unfortunately don't read that. But I think one of the interesting things in this, you know, in a sense, I think, you know, I'm kind of fellow traveller with the transnational. I'm a bit of fellow traveller with the transnational capitalist class. I see. I'm attracted to, you know, as I said, conceptually. I think there's a really powerful argument around that, and I think there's a whole argument about the national framing of capitalism that I've talked about. But one of the really interesting things about Polancis is that he talked about. You know, and I think he was ahead of his time. He talked about the interior bourgeoisie. I don't know if people remember, but he talked about essentially it's the fact that, you know, we couldn't talk about a comprador capital, and he was obviously talking about Greece and Western Europe. We couldn't talk about comprador capital, but neither could we talk about national capital, because national capital was no longer had the national scale on which to operate. You know, it was operating beyond the national scale. It was linked to, and you know, it was essentially talking about Europe in the 1970s. It was linked to various forms of US capital. So he talked about a new form, in a sense, the emergence of this, what he called this interior bourgeoisie, which I think is a useful way to think about. And I don't know how this relates to the TCC. But as I said, one of the really interesting things about this notion is the fact that it brings the state back into into our understandings of capital. Because for Polanskis, what was really crucial, I think, was the way in which these conflicts were actually played out within the state. So I think one of the things we need to get away from, as much as we get away from the idea of understanding sort of the national framing of capitalism, we need to get away from understanding the nation state as the nation state. In a sense, it doesn't mean when we talk about the transnationalization of class that we forget about the state. It's the fact that the state itself becomes more transnationalized. And it's the way in which these antagonisms and these conflicts are actually played out within the state. So to give you one quick example, kind of Australian example, look at the dispute between Rio Tinto and Chinalco that was played out in the Foreign Investment Review Board in Australia. Okay, at one level, this was seen as a fairly technical issue of what was a state-owned company, what was the national interest, so on and so forth. But at another level, you can see this as playing out of these conflicts that we've just talked about, at the level of these state and regulatory institutions. So one of the things I really want to emphasize here is that when we talk about, it's important to talk about class, but it's also important to talk about how these class conflicts are played out within the state apparatus, within regulatory institutions, and how, in a sense, it leads to the production, in a sense, of new kinds of regional and global institutions that are not located, in a sense, this is one of the problems that I alluded to earlier, that are not, in a sense, located somehow above the state, but in a sense, are kind of internalized within the state. So look, one of the arguments that I've been running with regionalism, for example, is that regionalism is quite often actually now located inside the state rather than outside the state. To give you one example, the Chiang Mai initiative, which is quite interesting, which is a very embryonic way of actually managing financial flows around East Asia. It's not much at the moment, but it's more than politically symbolic. But it's actually run by a network of East Asian central banks. It's run by policy networks, and the Reserve Bank of Australia actually plays quite a key role within that policy network. What does that then tell us about the changing social and political dynamics of the region? How does it play out within the transformation of the region? How does it play out in terms of the transnationalization, or in a sense what I'd like to call the regionalization of the Reserve Bank of Australia? And in a sense, this is what I mean by the need to understand the relationship, in a sense, between the state and what Polanskis would call this interior bourgeoisie. And I think this is, and the second point is the point that Jerry made as well. I think we should emphasize that a bit more. But none of this means that there's an automatic unfolding. There's not a kind of inevitable logic that unfolds to, to a kind of transnational order. As we saw with the Bush period, while, is the federal, and I think this is kind of one of the problems with Carnage and Gindin's work, is that, they sometimes see, the Federal Reserve as the kind of, the global central bank of the world, forgetting the fact that there are kind of national forces at work within the Federal Reserve as well, and quite often the Federal Reserve is caught between these competing currents. The final example I want to give quickly about about the way these conflicts play out is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is really interesting. When it first came out, I was actually, someone quoted me in the press, I just sort of said, well, it's not going to amount to much because there's going to be a lot of political problems. But I've had to eat my words, in part because there's been a greater political force behind it than I suspected. And one of the really interesting things about the TPP recently is the fact that China is now taking an interest in the TPP. And my argument about the TPP, and especially around this with geoeconomics, is that the TPP is not really about constructing a freer trade in this area, but it's actually a project of regulation. So if you look at the TPP, it is all about regulation. It's about introducing competition law. And more interestingly, the latest item that was added onto the TPP was on state enterprises. It's on managing, it's on setting limits and managing state-owned enterprises. And you don't have to be a genius to work out who that's aimed at. But why then was it taken up by China? Well, I think it's an interesting point, and I think it's an interesting point to think about this, because and I think in thinking about this, we need to apply that same lens about the transnationalization of the state of China. Because quite clearly there are elements and forces within the Chinese state institutions that see the TPP as a way of bringing about internal reform within China. So for these people, the TPP is seen as a way of putting extra political pressure inside the Chinese state to undertake some of these reforms. So it reflects, I think, some of the tensions that are now occurring within Chinese institutions. When I say Chinese institutions, it's at both the provincial and at the national level, between those pushing for a kind of a more state capitalist order and those pushing for more flexibility and more freedom for private capital. The other point I want to make is that this gets back to the international relations point of geoeconomics, is that a lot of people in international relations see the TPP as a way of containing China. And to my mind, that just doesn't make any sense, especially given the kind of linkages that I talked to about earlier. What I think the TPP is about is not so much about containing China, but as kind of if you like, the regulatory ordering of China. It is about setting in store a certain kind of regulatory project around which Chinese capitalism, especially around the region, needs to adopt if they want to have access to certain kinds of markets. And of course, this will be highly contested, both at the national level and in terms of competing regional projects that are coming out from the Chinese themselves, especially the Regional Comprehensive Economic Program, which in a sense reflects a different set of interests. I just want to finally, because I'm running out of time, I think I've got about 2 minutes. Well, I just wanted to talk about just one final point, because in a sense it's been the element that we haven't really talked about here, which is kind of odd, because we've talked about. And when I said I should qualify, there were quite a few really interesting papers last morning on this. But I think one of the things we need to think about, and this is a question that I asked, I think Frank last morning, about the new kinds of conflicts that are emerging. We talk about James O'Connor's second contradiction in capitalism. As we look around today, Turkey, Brazil, Egypt this morning, and obviously the ongoing protest in Europe around austerity. What's driving it? And I think the really interesting question for us as social scientists is to think about, are these conflicts the same old conflicts in traditional past that we'd seen earlier? Or in fact, is it taking on new forms? For example, one of the really interesting things about geoeconomics has been that there's been this kind of response, and the TPP is quite interesting, because the TPP has all these social chapters in it, including around labour, including around the environment, which is really about containing the contestation that's occurring. But it also opens up, I think, lots of possibilities. So for example, if you look around, food security at the moment is top of the agenda for everyone. And you think about, well, what does food security actually mean? What are the social and political and material interests involved in food security? And I think one of the things we need to do is to think about the way in which, and I think that well, I talked about the Euston, I'll end up on this, I talked about the Euston Manifesto that Doreen Massey and Stuart Hall put out. And one of the really interesting things I think that Doreen Massey says is that increasingly we need to think about, how these, you need to think about whether these are new forms of conflict, and especially whether these are new forms of conflict around issues of social reproduction. Food, health, environment, especially around urbanization in places like China. And what are the political implications, if that's true, of these struggles and conflicts around, in a sense, around collective consumption? And I think that I think that's probably, given my title, The Savage Wars of the Capitalist Peace, that's probably a nice place to end up on. Thank you.
And comments? That's the trouble when you do your session first. There isn't it?
They're still waking up.
Yes, Tom.
Yeah, I was interested, Kanishka, in your arguments about the TPP and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Programme being the Chinese version of the TPP, with my understanding without the United States. As I see it, there are two conflicting programs for the ordering of the Asia-Pacific Economic Zone, essentially. One of which China dominates and one of which the United States dominates, which in some ways does bear the mind, we bring to mind the traditional old ordering of the world. This time, instead of being the United States and the Soviet Union or Britain and Germany, it's now China and America. You're quite dismissive of it. I'd be interested to know why. But,
Even the RECP?
Yeah, no, you're dismissive of the fact that the our Regional Comprehensive Economic Programme was a... you said it was a different range of interest. You dismissive of the argument that the project of the TPP was to exclude China, contain China.
Yeah.
And you were saying how there was some interest within China in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But surely, for all I know, maybe the TPP might start including China, in which case the whole project begins to change in character. But in some ways, this ordering of the world, the reordering of the world now, this time between the United States and China, and their contest of power within the Asia-Pacific, the rising naval points of tension within the South and East China Seas, the building up of the Chinese military. Clearly every inter-imperialist conflict has its own specificities. But, isn't this, in what sense is this a new world? Lenin, after all, talked about the splitting over of capital from its natural boundaries once it's exhausted its natural markets and begun to develop new markets and internationalisation 100 years ago. So I guess the question comes back, isn't this the same old world in different colours?
Yes and no. I think that's a really good question that gets to all these issues. I think the problem there is actually, the problem there is in thinking about this as a competition between two sets of national capitalisms. It seems to me that what we have when we talk about the rise of China is, in a sense, it's a rise of China in a very different global context. We never had a world where global capital markets were disintegrated. We had globalization, true, between 1870 and 1914, but it was essentially around trade. It was never around. We never had the capital markets that were as deep as what we had, and we never had a situation where you had to, if this is a competition between China and the US, we never had a situation where, in a sense, the Chinese hold such a lot of US bonds, where essentially Chinese money was so essential to reproducing, in a sense, some of that social settlement in the US that kind of held that neoliberalism together. The kind of mortgage Keynesianism that I talked about. The bubble that's now burst. And I think that one of the things we had to grapple with is the way in which that's now reflected in these competing interests and competition within the state. No, but none of that is to say, I take your point that, when you look, just being back from Beijing, when you look around the South China Sea, and you see this massive build-up of militaries, and especially around the Philippines, and the conflict between Philippines and China. But at the same time, you see deepening linkages between the states. So you take Korea, for example, and its relationship with China. I mean, China is Korea's number one, its number one trading partner. Koreans are going to Shanghai by the plane loads to invest, companies like Hyundai are dependent on Chinese production facilities. But then at the same time, of course, at the same time that's happening, there's also, Korea's, the US, the Korean-US relationship is probably the most, apart from the Japanese, probably the most important one in Southeast Asia. So how do we understand that, and how do we understand conflicts within the Korean state when they actually grapple with things like the TPP and the RCEP? Because these conflicts and struggles are actually played out, and that is my point, within the Korean state. And what we need to understand is how, in a sense, the state itself is being internationalized and transnationalized. But none of that, I think, is to discount the importance of some of these some of those factors that you talked about.
Joan.
You mentioned the major protests in different countries, those that say Spain and Greece around austerity, and you I think mentioned Turkey and Brazil. What role do you? I mean, clearly, it seems to me there are very different sorts of imperatives with regard to those different movements. But what role do you think religion played in the Turkish situation?
I'm going to firstly say that, with the disclaimer, I'm not an expert on Turkish politics, and I hope you're not going to put this up on YouTube. But it seems to me that what's happening in Turkey is quite interesting, because in a sense, of course, you had the AK, which is the kind of Islamic party, was also the most, in a sense, the most neoliberal. I mean, it kind of dismantled the old kind of developmental state institutions in Turkey, and it went up against the the old elite. And it seems to me part of what's happening, and this is really based on reading blog posts and things like that have come out recently. This has been, part of this has been the disaffection of some parts of the middle class that were supportive of some of those elements. So I've been trying to understand, and I think this is kind of Derry Massey's point, is that these new protests have very complex class roots. I mean, they bring these different interests together. And I've got to confess, I just put it out there because I actually think this is a great topic to examine. And firstly, the linkages between these protests, because as you said, they're very different. But are there similar drivers? And what's the social basis of these protests as well? But it seems to me that the part of the response, so I said to someone last night that someone was sort of saying one of the interesting things about the Turkish movement is that it's been a women's movement as well. I mean, there's a high, and part of that is to do with the kind of regulations on consumption and lifestyle that the AK has introduced, which women especially are feel constrained by. So that's obviously a factor in this. But don't forget that the original protest in Turkey started off by trying to raise a park to set up a shopping mall. And that's something that we see playing out every day in places like China, where the land grabs. I've just been in China last week, where when I asked people, what do you think the number one social challenge is, and they kept telling me it's the land grabs, where shopping proprietors and for infrastructure or whatever just go in and take land. So in a sense, that's what in a sense I think that's a common element, and I'm only speculating, is to do around these struggles for collective consumption, where they'd be, especially around, the really interesting thing is the kind of massive urbanization that's taking place in China and to a much lesser extent in India. And the kind of social struggles and conflicts around that urbanization is something that we need that we need to understand much more fully. And I think we need, and I think that's taking place in a very different context. And quite often it's reflected in these struggles around issues of public space, around issues of collective consumption, around issues like housing, you know, the affordability of housing and access to housing. And in China, obviously, around access of migrant workers to social services, because remember that under the Chinese system, if you don't, you know, if you don't have a passport, you don't have access. You know, you might if you come from the western part of China to the eastern part of China, though there's been some reforms in that regulation, you don't necessarily have access to services. So your kids might not get to school. Your kids might not, you know, you might not have access to healthcare. So these have become, in a sense, the kind of issues that have galvanized these protests. But as I said, I think this is something we really actually need to do much more work on, and much more work on. Are there new settlements emerging as well? You know, I mean, how does the state, in a sense, respond to these conflicts?